Hello, beautiful people. Hey, I'm Kimberly Dark, and this is the Hope Desk. And I am a writer and a sociologist and storyteller, and I have some simple answers for you about complex social issues, about social inequality in particular. And so we meet here every month and talk about two social issues because I think that it is hopeful if more people know enough about basic issues to have civil conversations about them. And so that's really what we're here for. I certainly don't have all the answers. I don't have the only right answers, but I'll spend up to an hour, addressing some of these issues that folks have brought to my attention that they're struggling with. And so if there's anything you ever want to suggest for a future Hope Desk, you can do that on my social media, also through the website. And hey, I am not here to offer you in depth scholarship on any of these things. In most cases, other people are more qualified to do that than I am. But you know what? Sociologists often have a perspective on the architecture of everyday life that is helpful. And so that's what I'm here to offer for you too. And I want to thank Emily for coming in and managing these calls, and also let you know that you can use the chat box as we go along, and we'll get to a point where I'm gonna ask if you have questions, and so you can wait till then. You can use the chat box. I'm also just, as a spoiler alert, I'm going to get to the place where I ask you the question about how you might use the information that we are discussing today. So maybe think about that too. So hey, our two topics today are kind of big, and I feel like what I'm giving you, especially on the second one, is paltry, considering what a big issue it is. But we'll see if we can address the first one more thoroughly, and that has to do with government sponsored or government organized bounties. Now, why are we talking about this? My gosh, it has to do with that Texas Senate Bill 8 that just passed, that is all about basically limiting abortion to the point where almost no one can get one, because you'd have to know you were pregnant and need an abortion before 6 weeks is up, and most people don't know by then. There is a secondary weird thing attached onto this Senate bill, though, that has not been well understood, and that is the thing about a government offered bounty, this time in the form of being able to sue anyone you accuse of not just providing somebody with an abortion, but abetting abortion, which means anybody who might talk to a person about where to get one, anyone who might drive them in the car, even if it is an Uber driver who doesn't, know where they're taking the person, that person can be sued for $10,000 for abetting an abortion. And so I thought, hey, this is really worthwhile if we address the history of bounties in the United States, because it's a complex history that, it's a well established history, right? That is not just about, people think about bounty and they think about a fugitive that is on the run, and maybe a bail bonds person might put forth a bounty to catch that person. So that is one form of bounties. But actually, in the US, we have a history of the government using a bounty system to carry out absolutely terrible acts without taking full responsibility for them. So let's talk about that for a little bit, shall we? So, yeah, let's say you think that your neighbor, and you're in Texas, and you think that your neighbor has driven somebody to their appointment and there's going to be an abortion take place. You can go online or call a number and say, I accuse. And you can sue that person for $10,000. And if you win, that person has to pay you $10,000 plus all of your legal fees. If that person wins, their legal fees are not covered. And this is significant because what can happen is, obviously, you can accuse everybody and their brother that that has ever supported, abortion as healthcare, and those people can be injured by having to pay court fees and also be tied up in court, even just based on your accusation. So this is new, but not unprecedented. Bounty hunters often focus on fleeing criminals who owe a bail bond. Well, whether they're criminals or not, right? People who are accused. Um, but there is a longer history. And gosh, if we were in a classroom, I'd ask you for your thoughts on, where else is bail's bond, where else are bonds being paid or bounties being paid. But I'm just going to give you the big one. Um, Bounties were used in a big way in the United States when the US government wanted indigenous people cleared off of land that was going to be settled. And so the biggest way that this happened where the government was involved was the state of California, where more than 10,000 indigenous people were murdered. And this was during the few years around the gold rush. And scalping was a way to not have to drag the whole body in order to get paid. But what you got was $25 for a man and $5 for a woman or a child. Now, there were other parts of the United States where you could murder people, and the government says, yes, yes, go murder them and bring us back their scalps, and get up to $100 for a man, $50 for a woman, $25 for a child. And you have to think about how compelling this was in a time when a farmer might earn $100 in a whole year. So the incentive to go murder innocent people was very high. So this started to be less popular right around just after 1900 with the discovery of Ishi, a Yahi person who spoke no English and was not just the last person of his culture, but what actually happened was an anthropologist collected some of those stories and popularized them, and all of a sudden people were like, hang on, there are like people that are dying out. And they didn't really handle the fact that they weren't dying out on their own, they were being murdered, but it did make these bounties far less popular. you know we have this long history, and almost every state offered bounties for murdering indigenous people. And this is why when folks talk about the genocide against indigenous people, some of that seems like it was very passive because it had to do with the spread of disease. It actually wasn't, because many European groups were using the spread of disease to, they were using it as, biological warfare. But the part that definitely was not passive was the bounty system. In fact, Colorado just took a law off the books this year. This year, was to void a law that came out in 1864 in order to kill indigenous people. So, hey, I just want to say, bounties are not new. You can trace them back to the 1300s, and lots of other countries and lots of other places have used bounties. But I think, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, and hopefully if you're watching this later on YouTube and you know differently, let me know. I think this is the first time that bounties have been used with abortion. So there you have it, the history of bounties in the United States, and in particular, California's native population was devastated. 4/5 of the native population were wiped out in California. And yeah, that's sad and horrible. So, I rarely have really good news here, but sad and horrible. Does anybody want to ask questions or talk about the bounty system for abortions or the history of bounty in the United States?
You had said, Kimberly, that if you, all right, so regarding the who's okay, you had said, like, I help someone get an abortion, and you are a citizen and you sue me, I then pay you $10,000 and your legal fees.
Correct. And
But if
so
I'm
this,
found to be, you're suing me. If I'm found to have done nothing wrong, I just pay my lawyer and go home.
You pay your lawyer and go home, but think about how much money and time you've wasted at that
Yeah,
point.
no, I'm not minimizing it.
Yeah.
There's no, so
Eh,
who's
I mean,
scrutinizing the validity of these cases that people are raising?
that is precisely the point. So there is no kind of like there is no
System?
punishment. There is no punishment for a person who makes up a claim. And that's one of the big problems, is that you can accuse anyone, right? So there is nothing built into the Senate bill. Now it's possible that a judge might say, look, this is a spurious claim, and get out of my courtroom and don't do this again. But there's nothing built into that system that says a spurious claim is punishable, and so it's possible to to basically accuse anyone, and a judge decides. Now, you also just brought up a really interesting aspect of this, which is often in the history of bounties in the U.S., it is the government paying the bounty. Right? I go murder an indigenous
Mhm.
person, the government pays the bounty to me. But that's not the case with this particular bounty system. It is meant to cause financial suffering to the person deemed to be abetting the abortion. So that is a difference, right? That the government is not the one paying the bill when that happens.
That's smart because their coffers would get drained
Yeah, that's true.
really fast if they're like deputizing literally everyone with with a computer or a phone. Yeah.
That is indeed what's happening. Individual citizens are being, sent out to enforce, a law that, um, you know, under normal circumstances, it would be, an accusation would have to come from somewhere else, right? So, anything else about the history of bounties or this particular bounty system? I think we have yet to see how it's actually going to play out, because there has already been some grassroots activism about clogging up the website. People, writing in to accuse Governor Abbott in particular of giving abortions or something, whatever, having an abortion, whatever they're accusing him of. And so those are obviously spurious claims that are meant to uh, clog up the system and lodge a protest. So I think this is worth talking about. It's worth talking about bounties with whoever wants to talk about Senate Bill 8. And it's also worth connecting this current bounty system with all of the other bounty programs that the government has initiated since the beginning of our nation, because they are related, right? It is a way for the government to influence the populace to do a certain thing. Like, I'm sure that there were farmers in some of the parts of the US that were like, I was not going to go kill my neighbor, but $100, it's a lot of them. It's a year's salary, and so now I'm going to go do it. And that is a particularly nefarious way for a government to operate to influence its citizenry. Are you ready for another cheerful topic? I feel like I'm never talking about cheerful topics, but wow, these two are kind of terrible. So, hey, I want to talk to you also about abolitionist perspectives and mental health access. So, you know what happened last summer? We had a whole lot of focus on um, the idea that policing either needs reform or abolition in the United States. And that came out of the groundswell of revolt against George Floyd's murder. And so a lot of people took up this phrase, abolish the police. And there was, great consternation from like, well, so who do you call if something goes wrong, right? And I think that, I don't know. it might be an unfortunate term, or it might really be the hyperbole that is needed to move these topics forward. I don't know how that's going to go, but the whole idea of police abolition has to do with what do we fund in order to create public harmony and safety. That's the funding at the crux. What do we fund in order to do that? So, right now, we have a whole lot of our social peace and harmony, security, safety systems tied to policing. So I'll give you one example of this that is actually very personal to my life and my family right now. My mother has dementia, and she has no kind of paperwork in place that allows me to help her. And so her doctor opened an adult protective services file on her, which means they have been to her house, a social worker has been assigned, but they can't do anything to actually help her until a police officer picks her up in a public place and processes what in California is called a 5150, where she's basically hauled in and under supervision for a few days. Now, hopefully, it's easy to see that it might work better if she didn't have to be put into a police car and taken away before the social worker who is already on her case can actually bring the case forward to a court. Furthermore, take a look at me. My mother is white, and she is, she looks like a well-dressed little white lady. And how terrified might you be if your sometimes wildly belligerent parent were Black and needed to be picked up by the police before they could get help? Because, being wildly belligerent as a person with dementia is kind of like the prerequisite for somebody calling the police. So a lot of times people are, really terrified to enact these systems. Okay, so I have gone a long way to explain to you the troubles with pumping public money into the policing end of helping systems. But there are additional problems that people are now more often discussing about the structure of mental health services when it comes to public safety and harmony and peace. So let's start with mental health care access. This is a big topic, and I hope I'm going to say something useful for your future conversations. This topic was actually raised by a person regarding the privilege involved in doing self-work, which is sometimes something even beyond traditional mental health care access. But I think that the person was really asking about, well, there's privilege involved in even being able to take a long walk in nature or journal or read a book that might offer you self-care, because some people have to work 2 jobs in order to live indoors. Some people don't have the additional time available once they have cared for their families to even do basic, what we would call self-care. So this is true particularly for immigrants, for people of color, for anyone who works in minimum wage labor kinds of jobs. And ironically, often these are helping caretaker jobs, right? Like pretty much everyone who works in a nursing home, caring for patients is in that sort of minimum wage area. Same is true with preschool age childcare, this sort of thing. So access to mental health services often requires money, even if you have health insurance, right? Usually there's a copay, but especially if you don't. And so for marginalized folks, there are access barriers already. And then you add on the additional access barrier of finding a provider with whom you can feel comfortable, because they're not going to be actively racist or actively sexist or actively anti-immigrant. This is where we start to get into the issue of abolitionist perspectives on mental health care. So, when we start talking about abolitionist perspectives like prison abolition, right, there comes a discussion about abolitionist approaches to education, psychiatry, many other forms of help and betterment. And that's really what we're talking about here. So, some have oversimplified prison reform to mean that the funds should simply be diverted into mental health services instead, but that won't work unless mental health services are also non punitive. Oh, think about that for a moment. So, without changing the fundamental relationship with patients, those systems are often still using forms of incarceration as, at least as a stepping stone, in exactly the same way as the situation I just described, with my family members. So, in many cases, accessing those systems requires incarceration, even just for monitoring. And that same two-tiered system for people with money and people without money exists in this realm too. So, folks who are interested in abolitionist approaches to mental health services are calling into question even things like, what does a mandated reporter do? Like, if you're a mandated reporter, like somebody says, I am suicidal, what is the next step in that system? If it is that a person is brought into custody and held for a period of time, then that is not mental health care from an abolitionist perspective. And so, how can those kinds of systems be reformed in order to be non punitive and able to work with the patient, the individual? And you could ask the same thing about other kinds of mandated reporting as well. That, if somebody is a mandated reporter of child abuse or of sexual abuse, the question becomes, what happens next after the report is made? And is it possible to decolonize those approaches before we get so zealous about taking money out of policing and putting it into mental health services, which, is ostensibly a good idea, but not until we get there. One more thing I want to tell you about this, and that is also related to dominant forms of therapy. For instance, cognitive behavioral therapy is one that has been called up to task by some folks who are interested in abolitionist mental health reforms, because these forms of therapy do not always acknowledge social hierarchy and systems of oppression as reasonable causes of mental distress, right? So, if the therapist's goal is to change me to be able to deal better with the daily sexism that I experience, well, there's a problem there, right? Because we're not actually addressing the root issue. And potentially I get better at enduring things that actually may be criminal in nature, right? That actually may be, maybe I learn not to report the sexual harassment I'm experiencing at work, even if it is illegal, because it's better for my mental health if I learn to breathe and let it go. Well, I gotta have a glass of water here for this. Jesus, it's depressing. Hey, so there's lots more to say about the abolitionist approach to mental health care. And so I just want to say, too, as usual, the folks in disability activism have been trying to help the society for a very long time, bringing some of this stuff up. And it is wonderful to see the ways in which we're starting to pay attention to what those folks have been saying for a long time, but not nearly enough yet. Um, And now also folks living outside the gender binary are also bringing up additional red flags and calls to action that actually can help the entire society. And these groups and others have suffered mightily, not only the discrimination born of difference, but also the systemic oppression that leaves them without legal rights and open to merciless abuses. So I'm going to ask Emily to share. I've got two articles for you, as usual, that just kind of put forth some basic stuff. So I'll ask Emily to share both of those articles. And then I want to tell you about one other person. And if you happen to be on TikTok, um, Gigi Ali, and if I were good at this, I would have already found her TikTok address for you, but maybe Emily's going to do that.
Maybe I
Um,
will.
but she has put together an abolitionist provider list that is kind of in its fledgling stages, but really worth looking at if you're interested in mental health providers, or if you happen to be a mental health services provider who embraces this abolitionist perspective. Maybe you belong on her provider list. So lots of other people are discussing this too, but she has a TikTok account where she, how TikTok is. She gives like impassioned rants about this stuff that she knows actually a lot about. So that's a nice thing. I'm going to just pause for a moment and take a look at the chat and see that I'm not missing anything. Yes, Nancy, totally. Accessing mental health care also often requires gas money. I mean, like, even if all of your expenses are covered, which is not the case for the majority of Americans, right? Even if that's true, there still is the time off and the accessing. And yeah, and Claire's talking about slave retrieval, I'm guessing with regard to bounties, because that is certainly one of the places that we have had a bounty program in U.S. history. I just chose to focus today on indigenous genocide because I had to focus somewhere, didn't I? And that's a pretty horrible one. And also very clear use of how bounty programs allow the government to encourage individuals to do horrific things, sometimes even murder. So hey, definition of abolitionist. Somebody has asked about that. Thank you. So yeah, prison abolition. So abolition is, just means get rid of it. And in the history of the United States, slavery abolition was the first big movement related to abolition. So we have a system in place that does a thing, and we want to abolish it. You can also look at Angela Davis's work on prison abolition, which she started writing about back in the 70s, and is still one of the foremost people writing about that. And I think that a lot of times people want to think about things like prison abolition or defund the police in really simplistic terms, like, but if we don't do that, what will we do? But think about this. The same was true when people were talking about slavery abolition. Like, it was inconceivable that somehow, well, how are we going to create this much wealth and fabric, and how would that possibly work if we didn't enslave these inferior beings? Because remember, they were not even being considered human. So at every juncture in the US history, when something has been there's been a movement to abolish a social system, there has been this kind of, but I can't imagine it any other way. And so it only is a matter of time, of course. And I think we should have been listening to Angela Davis decades ago, but now all of a sudden there are people that are listening differently to Angela Davis. There's also a previous episode of the Hope Desk. I talked about this, I think, because I'm remembering now talking about Angela Davis and Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who's another person you could look up regarding prison abolition. So yeah, an abolitionist perspective to mental health care really means not abolish mental health care, but to abolish the way mental health care relates to the carceral state, relates specifically to imprisonment and the promotion of mainstream norms and ideas, as I mentioned with cognitive behavioral therapy, right? That um, because look, I mean, it does damage your mental health to have to deal with people saying that you are not a credible human being all the time. And that's what we're talking about with sexism and racism, and previously with slavery, and all of this. And so, what would that look like to abolish the idea within mental health care to that individuals need to change rather than systems of oppression needing to change in order to address that stuff. So, any other questions about abolitionist perspectives in mental health care? And furthermore, does anybody have ideas about how you might come into conversation about some of these things in the coming weeks? Like, are you in groups of people that have even mentioned the Texas abortion ban? Or are you in groups of people who talk about mental health care or self care, even? Maybe those are the kind of places where these topics might come up.
Kimberly, I've been applying for jobs for the last few weeks, and this is a little bit off topic, but it's just been really interesting to note and observe, like, in who in my process is even acknowledging the pandemic. You know, like, most people are not even acknowledging it. Some, not laying out like what their COVID guidelines are about doing in office work. And one guy I talked to yesterday and today he was a recruiter, so he's more on the people side, versus I work in tech, so a lot of the people that I talk to are very, like, I don't know, robotic, tech, technomatic. Anyway, the one recruiter was like, I missed our call, and then I had another mishap, and I was embarrassed, and he was like, "No, I've changed the way I judge people around these things since the pandemic. Like, we're all just doing our best." And it just felt so nice for him to acknowledge that, after
Yeah.
most people I've been talking to have just been like so business as usual, to a
So,
degree that it's like boggling my mind. I feel like I'm in an alternate universe.
except you're not in an alternate universe, and I think one of the things that you're bringing up is how and I think that the pandemic has brought up is how much capitalism drives the values that we have, the values that employers expect. And this is definitely, I think, an aspect of mental health care that is going to come out of this extended period of isolation, but also job shifts and the way that we work shifting, and the fact that everybody got out and, like, publicly banged pots and pans and, like, appreciated folks, and then still did not change their material circumstances, right? And we're like, as a culture, we have to deal with the repercussions of these things. Like, there are so many moments that are emerging in which it is clear that we do not live our values, our stated values. Like, I appreciate people in these helping professions, but fuck off, they don't get health care themselves, and they don't make enough money to live indoors, and they don't, right? Like, there's a lot of that I think we're going to have to grapple with. Candace, did you have a question?
I just wanted to offer that I was at an AAUW meeting the very first day that wasn't the law was enacted, and people talked about what can we do, and somebody reported that they had been at a NARAL meeting, and and they're ready to take actions. And then just out of the blue, some guy who goes to my church posted, so what if there was a video of Greg Abbott suggesting somebody have an abortion? And then, well, it just was this whole offered concept of, oh, well, fake news happens, and if you could just have fake news. It's all, yeah, people are talking about it, and I think, even though I think that guy was trying to be clever, I'm sure he's ready to act as well.
Right, right. I think you're right. I know this is it's a little bit of a diversion from the thing that I was discussing regarding bounty, but I think that there's a frustration also right now brewing regarding this Texas bill that, look, these kind of abortion bans influence poor women and women of color more than anyone else, like in a huge way. And we start seeing these jokes going around, which, like, well, what about every man gets a vasectomy and, and has to undo it in order to, oh, you don't want to do that because it's too close to your, bodily sovereignty. Oh, I see. I think we have to be very careful about how we are approaching these topics because, look, forced sterilization still happens in the United States. Forced sterilization is that's not a joking matter. And we have a long history of forced sterilization of women of color, of incarcerated women, of people with certain IQs, right? And so, it's a little tone deaf to be able to be talking about the abortion ban in these kind of terms. I mean, similarly, I watched The Handmaid's Tale, and I get these kind of, like, it's eerily close to how some of that story unfolded. And it is a reasonable critique to say, wow, so white women need to go to a work of fiction in order to somehow, address this issue rather than actually talking about the literal human beings, Black and brown women, who have been affected by this lack of abortion access around the United States for the last 30 years. And so it's tricky. But I just wanted to stick in the chat there. You mentioned AAUW's American Association of University Women. Thank you for that comment. Anything else about abolitionism and mental health services? Yes.
I wanted to point out one of the reasons my reading is that they are doing it via bounty is that it makes it that much more difficult to actually bring a case to the Supreme Court, because who has standing in this situation to contest it? So I found that to be really a very clever, it seems to be an extremely cleverly written law. And the fact that they're taking it under the not even having to make a public argument about it, I find it to just be very, very interesting in that sense that the people writing this are clearly not idiots and have given it a great deal of thought as to how to take this down.
It's a masterpiece, actually. I mean, it is a masterpiece of manipulation, because understand that in the United States, the majority of people support abortion as healthcare. They support access to abortion. And the idea that states are rallying, certain politicians are rallying to accomplish this, because this is the next threshold, is that other states will use this as a model. And so, that's scary business. I also feel I feel duty bound whenever we talk about this idea of abortion. There's a whole essay on this in my last book. Look, I feel like I'm going to do an ad now. My last book, Damaged Like Me. There's a whole essay about this. That, look, we already have bodily sovereignty laws in the United States that say if somebody is in a car accident and they need your blood transfusion to survive, you can say no. And when that person dies, it's not your fault. And let me just tell you, giving somebody a little bit of your blood is a hell of a lot less traumatic than carrying a pregnancy full term and giving birth to a whole human. And so the idea that some other human should be able to use your body as a host in that way for almost an entire year like is absurd from the perspective of bodily sovereignty laws, which are already in place. So essentially, any of these restrictions on women's bodily sovereignty is redefining women as less than human, less than having a body with the same rights as a person with no womb, right? So I feel like we need to keep bringing that fact up. How did we come this far with these kind of arguments when there are already bodily sovereignty laws in place? Bodily autonomy laws is what they're called. So I think we need to keep talking about that, and also potentially keep reframing the issue, right? That pregnancy doesn't happen because of sex. Stay with me here. Pregnancy happens because sperm somehow gets near a womb. As you can have sex all day long, if there is no sperm getting anywhere near a womb, there is no danger of pregnancy, right? And so we have such a cognitive frame on the idea of who is responsible for pregnancy that it makes it look like women are responsible. But if sperm stays away from a womb, there is never a danger of pregnancy, right? And then you add in the fact that, a man can impregnate hundreds of women in the 1 year it takes a woman to gestate a child. And it starts being a very different conversation about where is the responsibility for, for abortion. And so I think we need to keep reframing these issues so that they can be seen differently, so that women can be seen as fully autonomous human beings, and also so that pregnancy can be understood as a meeting of sperm and womb, not as a product of sex. Yeah, Thane.
I keep thinking that we could explore a different messaging in the sense that clearly people talk about choice, but I also think that we could point out the fact that hundreds of women will die in childbirth, and that we're actually talking about a dictatorship of health, because the right is constantly talking about a tyrannical state interfering in their rights for guns, be that what it may. And I really think that if we were to explore trying to find a new message that says, hey, I am against the dictatorship of a state forcing women to die.
Yeah.
I know it's not as catchy as choice, but there is some phrase that needs to be created to change the paradigm thought from it's about choice to pointing out what is happening now is that the state is dictating the death of hundreds of women by this policy, which is a form of tyranny.
Yeah.
The very definition of tyranny is killing your citizens.
Listen, I think that's a great reframe. I've got no problem with any of these possible reframes, right? Like, I think we need all of these possible reframes to be able to, latch on and understand these issues differently than we are currently discussing them. We are almost done with our time. If there's anything else y'all want to talk about, I'm here for it. Otherwise, you can find past episodes of the Hope Desk on YouTube, and you can find me on social media, and maybe Emily has even that info to put into the chat box as well, along with the articles I've given you are pretty self-explanatory, I think. I don't really have a lot more to say about that. One is about bounty, the other about the Disability Visibility Project.
I'm finding it. I'm
All
looking,
right.
searching, hunting, finding.
You know what? You can find me on social media your own self. Anything else today? All right, good people. I'll be here next month, and we'll talk about two other things. You know what I think I have in the queue is one of the topics for next month is gerrymandering, but I need to look up and make sure we've not discussed that before. I'm starting to lose track now. But Emily, was there something you
No,
had a
I'm
hand?
just hunting around for your links.
Don't worry about it.
No.
But really, please do contact me on social media or via the website to suggest other topics if you've got something that you think, this came up, but I didn't know what to say about it. That's what we're here for. Please have more civil conversations in your life. See y'all later.
Thanks, everyone.